The American West. A place of romanticism, lassos, herds, buckles, boots, open plains, teal blue never-ending sky, and a reddened earth to match. Where many a lonesome rider rode their histories into dust, and where others implanted theirs in the myths and recollections of those who would form histories of their own or thereof. We love the American West. We love the riders on the storm of their own destinies, making their lives what we want for our own. The lives of freedom. All American freedom. And for some reason, that freedom seems only capable in the great American West, via the entity of violence. The American West. There have been many attempts to depict these regions. Ever since the Americans set their roots in these lands hundreds of years ago, many a tale has been told in various forms regarding the who, what, when, where, and whys of its inhabitants and those who took it. These tales began in the late 1800 writings of the dime novels and continued their route into the modern Western feature film, still finding its form in modern cinema as we know it. A whole new genre had emerged. But with every genre comes a subgenre, a visceral reaction against the status quo, the do's and don'ts, the rules and regulations of that particular mode of storytelling. And one writer, in subverting this genre, managed to capture the American West better than any other before or since. One writer saw the American West for what it was, and from whence its violent origins stemmed. That writer was Cormac McCarthy in his 1985 book, Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West. Born Charles Joseph McCarthy Jr. on July 20th, 1933 in Providence, Rhode Island, USA, McCarthy's life would be one of defiance from the comfortable origins he had began in. His father, Charles Joseph McCarthy, and mother, Gladys Christina McGrail McCarthy, had 6 children. McCarthy was the third child and first son. McCarthy's father was a Yale Law School graduate whose work moved the family to Knoxville when McCarthy was 4. Knoxville would be where McCarthy would experience his most formative years. Here, McCarthy would attend the University of Tennessee between 1951 and 52. A brief spurt in the Air Force between 1953 and 1957 would see McCarthy stop his studies momentarily, but he soon returned back to university. Whilst at university, McCarthy would publish 2 short stories in the student-run literary magazine The Phoenix. His stories were titled A Drowning Incident and Wake for Susan. Perhaps these early publications sparked a passion in McCarthy, one too strong to resist, for he dropped out of university in 1960 to pursue his passion for the written word. Whilst writing, McCarthy worked part-time in an auto parts warehouse, and around this time he also married his first wife, Lee Holman. Together they had 1 child, Cullen McCarthy. Unfortunately, this marriage didn't last long, and the two divorced in 1962. But as McCarthy's first marriage was coming to its end, his literary career had just begun to form. In 1965, McCarthy would publish his first novel, The Orchard Keeper, under which he would first use the name Cormac McCarthy, which, as would become a trend in the first half of his literary career, would see critical success and commercial failure. With regards to the former, McCarthy's efforts had not gone completely unrecognised, as he was awarded the William Faulkner Award alongside the American Academy of Arts and Letters Fellowship, the money with which McCarthy used to travel to Europe. Whilst in Europe, he met English dancer, singer, and soon-to-be second wife Anne DeLille. The two married in England in 1966. 2 years following his marriage to DeLille, McCarthy published his follow-up novel, Outer Dark. McCarthy had worked on this novel whilst in Europe. However, McCarthy and DeLille moved to Tennessee by the time of its publication. Outer Dark, much like The Orchard Keeper, sold poorly but did gain enough critical attention for McCarthy to be awarded a fellowship for creative writing by the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. McCarthy's next novel, Child of God, would be published to a very similar reception. After the publication of Child of God, McCarthy's second marriage had begun to fall apart, leading to McCarthy moving to El Paso, Texas in 1976, following his and DeLille's separation. McCarthy would continue writing and follow up with his most autobiographical novel, Suttree, in 1979, once again to poor sales. McCarthy would eventually reach critical and commercial success in 1992 upon the publication of his sixth novel, All the Pretty Horses. Finally, the decision to pursue writing would pay off 32 years later. McCarthy's career trajectory continually rose from 1992 onwards. It must have been incredibly validating for him. But how did he manage to live through those 22 years in obscurity? How were the bills being paid? The latter question McCarthy must have asked himself frequently in those obscure years. As of writing this script, 2 biographies on McCarthy are being written that will no doubt shed some light on McCarthy's financially turbulent years. But as it stands, there is not a lot of information out there about McCarthy within this early stage. There is, however, a now mythic building anecdote that stems from McCarthy's second wife, Anne DeLisle, which gives an insight into his conditions during these 3 years. Long after the end of their marriage and during the years of McCarthy's ascent in popularity, DeLisle gave an interview to the New York Times wherein she spoke of hers and McCarthy's frugal existence in the 1970s. When the couple moved to Tennessee, the two lived in a renovated dairy farm. Their day-to-day consisted of bathing in the lake and eating beans. A less than ideal lifestyle, some may say, but this lifestyle wasn't necessarily through circumstance alone. It was technically a choice. McCarthy, despite his and DeLisle's living conditions, routinely turned down monetary offers to speak about his work in universities, as, McCarthy reasoned, everything they, the audience, needed to know was there on the page. McCarthy was turning down thousands of dollars when he gave his reasoning, and as a result, he and DeLisle went back to eating nothing but beans for another week. I'm not surprised this marriage didn't last. That all being said, McCarthy did have support along the way. Between the publication of The Orchard Keeper in 1965 and All the Pretty Horses in 1992, McCarthy kept himself financially afloat, primarily, at least from what I could tell, through fellowships and grants. If you're curious about the difference between the two, it's this: a grant funds a project, a fellowship funds a person. McCarthy received both during his career, but he received the most prestigious fellowship in 1981, the MacArthur Fellowship, also known as the Genius Grant. This fellowship funded McCarthy for the next 4 years of researching and writing, the fruits of which labour would appear in Blood Meridian. McCarthy's research for Blood Meridian was extensive. It included riding horseback in his characters' locations, to the best of his ability at least, becoming acquainted with the American West, and reading up on the region's history. In later years, correspondence between McCarthy and a friend would come to light in which McCarthy stated he had read over 300 volumes during his research. Following McCarthy's death on June 13, 2023, a team of scholars and McCarthy enthusiasts, led by literature and humanities scholar Brian Jaimza, were given access to McCarthy's personal library. What they found was 20,000 books stacked at random all around his house. These books fell to every and any topic: literature, philosophy, physics, history, engineering, architecture, fashion, etc. When sifting through this monumental collection, the team sorting through it found the vast majority of these books were marked and dog-eared. McCarthy's collection gives insight into his being, a high intellect amongst chaos. You could say he was an autodidact. With this in mind, his claim of having read over 300 volumes during the research of Blood Meridian is likely true, perhaps even an understatement. Blood Meridian is a historical novel set during the mid-1800s in North America. For those unaware, a historical novel presents fictionalized stories within real-world events and/or settings. Examples of historical novels can be found in War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque, For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway, Mason and Dixon by Thomas Pynchon, and Europe Central by William T. Volmium, to name a few. The historical novel may pull from its author or from research alone. For example, Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls is set during the Spanish Civil War. That took place between 1936 and 1939, a war Hemingway had covered as a journalist. In the book, there is a scene recounted by the character Pilar, wherein Spanish Republicans surround a nationalist-filled church. The Republicans began ordering out the nationalists one by one, directed them toward a cliff, and, after suffering brutal beatings, were thrown off to their deaths. It's a classic scene in a classic novel, and one that Hemingway had witnessed firsthand as a war correspondent. Other examples include Leo Tolstoy's descriptions of the war between Russia and France in the early 1800s in War and Peace, as being pulled from his own experience fighting in the Crimean War. Another and more direct example can be found in Remarque's experience fighting for Germany in World War I, colouring the entirety of All Quiet on the Western Front, the characters of which are, of course, fictional. Of the 5 examples given, William T. Volman's Europe Central and Thomas Pynchon's Mason and Dixon are similar to McCarthy's Blood Meridian in that little personal experience is directed into the narrative due to the gap between the author writing their book and the events written about. Therefore, a lot of reading had to be conducted to get the feel of the historical time frame they were attempting to convey. McCarthy did not shy away from the research process, as we can see in his 300+ volume claim. We don't know book for book exactly what McCarthy read, yet. Nonetheless, we evidently know the time frame of the novel, that being 1833 to 1878, the years in which the main character, the kid, lives and dies. According to John Seepitch's 2008 book, Notes on Blood Meridian, 1833 and 1878 are the mileposts for when violent relations between the Americans, the Mexicans, and the natives were at their height. In other words, the violence we associate with the American frontier largely occurred between 1833 and 1878. Seepitch marks the scalping of Josiah Wilbarger in August 1833 as the beginning of this violent period, with the eventual near extermination of buffalo by 1878 marking the end. The former increased the hostility towards the natives, whereas the latter indirectly killed the natives off, as they were heavily reliant on the buffalo for resources. This is not to say that violent relations were non-existent before and after this period, just that they had accelerated within it. McCarthy, combining history and fiction, is set to bring this violence to life. The more we learn of McCarthy's methods as a writer, and we still know very little, the more we come to appreciate his predilection for building his works of fiction on locales in the real world. McCarthy travelled by auto and on horseback through much of the territory described in the book, following the trail of Glanton's gang as best he could. The Western frontier was a highly dangerous and violent yet profitable region for many reasons. The area saw countless atrocities and massacres, all in brutal fashions unthinkable to many of us today. The frontier favoured the individual, the man who could lead other men on expeditions, either gruesomely doomed or immensely lucrative. With so much to gain and so much to lose, and to lose brutally, the worst of humankind was on full display in these reddened plains. Blood Meridian, as I'm sure you all know, is an incredibly violent book. It's no wonder McCarthy chose the American Western frontier as the backdrop to display such violence. The bone of one event is connected to the next bone on either side, no matter how far back you go into history. Nonetheless, for the purposes of understanding how the Western frontier came to be what it was, I'll have to choose some place to start. In my opinion, to get the full picture, I believe the best starting point to be 1540. The year 1540 was the year Spanish conquistador Francisco Vasquez de Coronado led an expedition to the southwest of North America, that being Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Oklahoma, and Kansas, under the impression of there being cities of gold, practically just waiting to be conquered. Instead of finding any gold, however, Coronado came across the natives, whom, as will become a recurring theme in this part of the Americas, he killed. Coronado's expedition lasted 2 years before he returned to Mexico, at that time under Spanish rule, empty-handed. His dreams of making himself anything beyond an opportunist were squandered. In 1598, another Spanish conquistador by the name of Don Juan de Onate brought 400 settlers, including women and children, across the Rio Grande and into El Paso, Texas. From here, Don Juan's men were sent out into small teams where they would scavenge and claim their stake in various locations, establishing New Mexico in the process. The move was small at first, but by 1680 around 2,400 Mexicans were living in New Mexico, and this would only grow from here. According to John S.D. Eisenhower's book, So Far From God, The U.S. War with Mexico 1846 to 1848, the natives were generally quite docile upon the introduction of the Spanish and Mexican settlers. By 1800, according to Eisenhower, the population of New Mexico had grown to around 30,000, with only a third of them being Native Americans. By 1821, the Mexicans would gain independence from Spain. owning the entirety of the southwestern half of the Americas. On the east side of the Americas, the British had established 13 colonies between 1606 and 1740, beginning in Virginia and expanding along the eastern coast. On July 4th, 1776, the Americans gained independence, and the British relinquished their control over the colonies. The American War of Independence would officially end on September 3rd, 1783. With the end of the war, the Americans would continue expanding westward. By 1803, the now independent Americans owned half of what today is the United States of America. To recap then, to the west of the Americas, California, Arizona, New Mexico and Texas, you had Mexican rule, whereas everything to the east was under American rule. To make things more complicated, situated in the northwest, you had Oregon County, jointly owned by the Americans and the British since 1818. All the while, the Native Americans lived in pockets scattered around the land, attacking and being attacked by Americans and Mexicans alike. The 1840s would prove a pivotal decade in the history of America and Mexico. Manifest Destiny, the belief in the God-given right to expand, saw Americans settling in Mexican-owned land, with the most contentious example of this being in Texas. During boundary disputes between the Americans and Spain, before Mexico's independence, the Americans gave up Texas in exchange for Florida in 1819. Upon Mexico's independence, Americans changed their mind and set about retrieving Texas for themselves. Thus, border disputes turned to war, which resulted in Texan independence being partly established in 1836. I say partly because, despite a treaty being signed by the president turned self-proclaimed dictator of Mexico, Santa Anna, also referred to as the Napoleon of the West, the Mexican government itself simply decided not to acknowledge this signing. Following the Battle of Jacinto on April 21, 1836, and following his signing of the treaty, Santa Anna fled back to Mexico and continued his pursuit of retaining Texas. But unfortunately for him, even though Mexico didn't recognize Texan independence, the rest of the world did, particularly America, who were salivating at the prospect of welcoming Texas into its arms. These border disputes continued until May 30th, 1845, when the Mexican government gave Texas the offer of either accepting Mexican recognition without being able to join another country, or remaining with them. The alternative to those two was annexation into the United States. It was highly likely Texas would choose the latter. However, just to be sure, expansionist enthusiast President James K. Polk sent 2,000 troops led by General Zachary Taylor to Fort Jessup in Louisiana in June 1845. Tensions grew between the Americans and Mexicans, and by May 13, 1846, the Americans declared war following a shootout between the two nations in the previous month. Additionally, by June, the Americans and British had come to an agreement regarding Oregon County, and the area was divided up into the line that separates America and Canada today, with the Brits occupying the latter. The Mexican-American War would last 2 years, with the Americans coming out victorious and taking the West entirely, concluding what today makes up the United States of America. A lot of men, Mexican and American alike, and of course the natives who get caught in the middle of everything, came out the other end of this war traumatized, capably violent, and in need of new ways to make a living. Some stayed in the military, some returned to their homes, and others stayed in the West and saw opportunity, a mirage-like promise that seemed to reach all those who travelled upon those reddened plains. So McCarthy had all of that to account for in Blood Meridian. The landscape of the novel is a character within itself, speaking to the characters through nature as they traverse the land, its history hanging over them like the sword of Damocles. Some people have said that Blood Meridian has no plot, but for the purposes of this script, an overview is at least worth a try. The story centres around the kid, whose name we never learn or whose interior monologue we never hear. He is quiet, he sometimes isn't mentioned for pages, and he is, most of all, capably violent. Despite this, there is something within the kid that suggests hope in this hellish landscape. We follow the kid from his birth in 1833 until his death in 1878. However, the bulk of the novel takes place after the Mexican-American War. The kid, after having run away from his home, finds himself journeying without any destination through the western plains. Eventually he is taken in by Captain White, who leads him, the kid, and another group on a botched expedition that results in most of the men being killed by a Comanche attack. The kid escapes, makes his way to Chihuahua City, and is picked up by a gang of scalp hunters known as the Ballantyne Gang. The Ballantyne Gang isn't a locked unit. Granted, they want people who can fend for themselves, but they aren't averse to picking up stragglers along the way. With this in mind, I just wanted to quickly note some of the more prominent members of the gang and note a characteristic to help keep them in your mind. There will be some characters that I'll elaborate on, of course, but in the interest of simplicity, I'll still name those later to be expanded on characters too. The kid, of course, the main character. Toadvine, the kid's friend before joining the gang, also has the letters H, T and F branded on his forehead. John Joel Ballantyne, leader of the gang. The judge, Ballantyne's right-hand man, 7 foot tall, albino, bold, likes to get naked, supernatural, dances a lot, plays the fiddle, never sleeps. David Brown, wears a necklace of human ears. Charlie Brown, brother of David Brown, the man with a necklace of human ears. Doc Irving, despite being a doctor, at one point refuses to pull out an arrow from another of the gang. Marcus Long Webster, guy who got pissed off at the judge for trying to draw him. Sam Tate, no relation, once part of the Texas Rangers. Bath Cat, neither a bath nor a cat, also referred to as the Vandy Melander, also has a necklace of ears. Juan Miguel, shot by Ballantyne out of mercy. Grimly, stabbed by a drunk in a bar fight. Black John Jackson, kills White John Jackson. White John Jackson, killed by Black John Jackson. The Idiot, the judge's slave. Tobin, the priest. There are a few more characters that come and go throughout the narrative, but more or less, these names are the most notable. So, what is the Ballantyne Gang? Well, dear viewer, the Ballantyne Gang are scalp hunters led by none other than John Joel Ballantyne. Who would have thought? As previously mentioned, the majority of Blood Meridian's plot is set just after the Mexican-American War, a time when a good portion of combat veterans chose to stay in the western states they had just helped to take from the Mexicans. These men needed a means of making money, and at that time, one of the most lucrative jobs that attended perfectly to their skill sets was scalping Native Americans. Many men engaged in this trade and many made fortunes. The mortality rate was high, but the potential money to be earned was, for some men, too much to turn down. All these men had to do was bring back native scalps, and they would be paid a fee per scalp. The scalp would prove the death of the native to the person paying the hunter, whilst also inflicting greater torture, literally and spiritually, upon the native. With regards to the spiritual, the latter is due to the natives' behalf. This is due to the natives' belief that the removal of their scalps would not allow them to transcend to a higher plane in death. It was cruel in every way imaginable, although it is worth mentioning that scalping went both ways. In Blood Meridian, the vast majority of the narrative is spent with Ballantyne and his scalp hunters as they ride around the western frontier, engaging in brutal displays of violence. The kid remains with the gang until their eventual demise at the Yuma Ferry massacre, wherein the Native Americans ambush the gang, killing all but a few. I would like to refrain from simply retelling the story of Blood Meridian, as the book is there to be read. What I want to do is pick out notable moments and characters, analysing the historical context and the books McCarthy pulled from when constructing these scenes, and the writing thereof. I will then culminate in the American West, and how Blood Meridian, particularly in the character the Judge, is the perfect representation of that bloody period in American history. A period overly romanticised and idealised, but not in Blood Meridian. Following the commercial success of his 6th novel, All the Pretty Horses, McCarthy agreed to an interview with the New York Times, wherein he stated that books are made out of books. What could be perceived as a humble acknowledgement of literary influences and inspirations actually holds more truth than may be perceivable to the casual reader. When McCarthy wrote that he had read over 300 volumes during the research of Blood Meridian, he didn't just mean with regard to historical accuracy, but also for the characters whose stories he was going to inflict with his fictionalized retelling. There are books dedicated to showing the influence of other books on McCarthy's Blood Meridian, from the characters to the events to passages, all of which would be too hard to cover in great detail for this video alone, as there are just so many, but nonetheless I will pick out some that I found to be the most interesting, because Blood Meridian is a book made out of books. Whilst there are over 300 to choose from, there is no doubt the most important book behind Blood Meridian is Samuel Chamberlain's My Confession, Recollections of a Rogue. Chamberlain was a character in his own right. He fought in the Mexican-American War. He actually fought under General Zachary Taylor, who he personally disliked, which isn't saying much because Chamberlain didn't like anyone, and he rode with the Ballantyne gang too. He produced one of the most detailed accounts of Ballantyne's gang, the accounts of which he wrote in the mid-1800s, but that were published years following his death, in the early 1900s. Chamberlain's memoirs were discovered in the mid-1900s, and were first published serially in Life magazine before being turned into a book. The serialized version of Chamberlain's memoirs had sections omitted, yet once all parts had been published, the full book was published in 1956. This would have been the version McCarthy had read, as it contains characters inside that McCarthy would use for Blood Meridian, most notably Judge Holden. Yes, the nearly 7-foot albino baby looking scalp hunter was, according to Chamberlain's memoirs, a real person. Or at least, McCarthy's version was an exaggerated version of Chamberlain's Judge Holden, who, to be fair, still sounds unrealistic when described by Chamberlain. Here is how Chamberlain describes the judge in his memoir. The second in command, now left in charge of the camp, was a man of gigantic size called Judge Holden of Texas. Who or what he was no one knew, but a cooler-blooded villain never went unhung. He stood 6'6" in his moccasins, had a large fleshy frame, a dull tallow-coloured face destitute of hair and all expression. His desires was blood and women, and terrible stories were circulated in camp of horrid crimes committed by him when bearing another name, in the Cherokee Nation and Texas. And before we left Frontieras, a little girl of 10 years was found in the chaparral, foully violated and murdered. The mark of a huge hand on her little throat pointed him out as the ravisher, as no other man had such a hand. But though all suspected, no one charged him with the crime. Now here's how McCarthy describes the judge in Blood Meridian. An enormous man dressed in an oilcloth slicker had entered the tent and removed his hat. He was bald as a stone and had no trace of beard and had no brows to his eyes nor lashes to them. He was close on to 7 feet in height, and he stood smoking a cigar even in this nomadic house of God, and he seemed to have removed his hat only to chase the rain from it now he put it on again. Judge Holden's physicality is in itself peculiar. Standing in Blood Meridian almost 7 feet tall, completely without hair and with piercing white skin, Holden's physicality and countenance completely differ from the rest of the group. McCarthy's depiction of the judge, in both this quote and throughout Blood Meridian, portrays a moral yellowness. That being, as William T. Vollmann puts it in his 2004 meditation on violence Rising Up and Rising Down, the aesthetic handmaiden of violence. In other words, moral yellowness is the perception of being violent via a person's external signifiers like their posture, countenance, or physicality. Whilst never a good starting point for judging another's propensity for violence, it can be applied for the judge. However, whilst the judge physically intimidates, he is also charming. So charming, in fact, that he becomes suspicious. Vollmann elaborates on this apparent friendliness that hides murderous intentions. I grant the obvious fact that people's appearance may on occasion reveal their intentions, their emotions, etc. The man in the bar to whom I have said nothing, who sneers and glares at me, puts me rightfully on my guard. In that sense, there are in fact physiognomies of aggression, but that is only because these souls act out of rage which shines through their flesh like fire behind a paper screen. However, should their moral spectrum be laid out differently than mine, their feelings as displayed by their bodies may be connected to different behaviours than I might expect. What if it makes the stranger tranquilly joyous to contemplate murdering me? What if, like Desard's protagonists, they delight in caressing before they destroy? Then their friendliness is what I must fear. Among the indications of antisocial character disorder in which category Goring had been placed is this one. Often a charming, likeable personality with a disarming manner and an ability to win the liking and friendship of others. Typically good sense of humour and generally optimistic outlook. The judge's intense charm and friendliness could be a manipulation tactic, or almost a verbal salivation at the violence he knows he could or will commit. The paradox between physical meanness coupled with an undeniable charisma presents this moral yellowness in the judge that unsettles the reader and the characters in Blood Meridian, who both struggle to make sense of what he is thinking or doing most, if not all, the time. Another component that sets Judge Holden apart from everyone else, and what is arguably his most frightening characteristic, is Holden's intellect. Once again, taking from Chamberlain's memoir, he describes Holden as the best educated man in northern Mexico. As we come to see in Blood Meridian, McCarthy's Holden is the same, if not more educated. He appears to know everything. He waxes poetic and philosophizes over the heads of Glanton's men whilst understanding all topics under the sun. Many scenes throughout the book demonstrate this intellect, but one of the most notable is when the judge saves Glanton's gang by creating gunpowder out of raw materials from the earth. The gunpowder scene occurs in chapter 10 and is relayed to the kid by Tobin. Glanton's gang had found themselves without ammunition and being tracked down by natives. Their situation was dire, yet whilst travelling through the desert, they happened to come across the judge, sitting on a rock as if he had been expecting them. Glanton speaks to the judge, and the judge rides along with the gang, directing the gang toward a volcano. The gang trust the judge, for they have nothing left to lose. Beyond the Malpais was a volcanic peak, and in the sunrise it was many colours, and there was dark little birds crossing down the wind, and the wind was flapping the judge's old Benjamin about him, and he pointed to that stark and solitary mountain and delivered himself of an oration, to what end I know not, then or now. And he concluded with the telling us that our mother the earth, as he said, was round like an egg and contained all good things within her. The gang reaches the volcano's peak, and the judge starts combining raw materials, including the gang's, besides Glanton's, urine, to create gunpowder. Just as the natives neared the top of the volcano, the men reloaded their weapons and fired upon them, killing every last one of the natives. The judge remains with the group ever since. The aforementioned quote wherein the judge describes the earth as containing all good things within her is a reference to John Milton's 1667 epic poem Paradise Lost. In Book 6 of the poem, a scene occurs wherein Satan speaks to his fallen angels, one of whom was complaining about insufficient weaponry, and states a similar sentiment to the judge upon the volcano's base, that the earth offered everything they needed. Whereto with look composed Satan replied, "Not uninvented that which thou art right. Believest so main to our success I bring. Which of us who beholds the bright surface of this ethereous mould whereon we stand, this continent of spacious heaven adorned with plant, fruit, flower, and broisel gems and gold, whose eye so superficially surveys these things as not to mind from whence they grow, deep underground, materials dark and crude, of spirituous and fiery spume, till touched with heaven's ray and tempered they shoot forth, so beauteous opening to the ambient light." The parallels between Satan and his fallen angels in Paradise Lost and the judge and the Glanton gang in Blood Meridian are obvious. For one, Satan in Paradise Lost gives his men gunpowder too. Two, the backdrop of the gunpowder scene in Blood Meridian is a volcano, as hellish as a backdrop as you're going to get. Thirdly, like the judge, Satan in Paradise Lost is incredibly charismatic. In fact, he's the only enjoyable character to follow in the book, which is part of the danger of him. If a negative was wholly negative, it would remain untouched. But negatives are often enticing, and in the case of these characters, their enticing nature is through their sheer charisma, the type that leads weak men off cliffs. Speaking of these men, there are similarities too. Seepitch said that, whilst John Joel Glanton is the leader of the gang, the judge is the spiritual leader. The gunpowder scene acts as a satanic pact between the two men. If looking for more Paradise Lost parallels, the Glanton gang are like Satan's fallen angels, outcasts of society choosing a life of violence. Another famous scene appears prior to the kid meeting Glanton's gang that contains many influences from past literary works. It occurs in chapter 4, wherein the kid is attacked by a horde of Comanches whilst riding with the fated Captain White. The Comanche attack scene is another iconic one, which I want to expand on when speaking on the books that played a role in its construction. However, before I do so, I want to speak on the happenings prior to the attack itself. In the previous chapter, chapter 3, when the kid is introduced to Captain White, the latter spouts off about his contempt for how the government has handled the land ceded to them since the war, claiming it has fallen back into the hands of savages. The captain leaned forward. We fought for it, lost friends and brothers down there, and then by God if we didn't give it back. Back to a bunch of barbarians that even the most biased in their favour will admit have no least notion in God's earth of honour or justice or the meaning of republican government. A people so cowardly they've paid a tribute 100 years to tribes of naked savages, given up their crops and livestock, mines shut down, whole villages abandoned, while a heathen horde rides over the land looting and killing with total impunity, not a hand raised against them. What kind of people are these? The Apaches won't even shoot them. Did you know that? They kill them with rocks. The captain shook his head. He seemed made sad by what he had to tell. This diatribe is rehearsed. Whether the kid agrees or not is hard to tell. We are never given insight into the kid's inner monologue, and so we can only speculate as to his intentions when riding out with Captain White and his men. I can only assume, however, that the kid's intentions were less to do with taking back what's ours, or any feeling of honour, and more to do with the expedition being a job. Nonetheless, Captain White's comment on honour needs a brief breakdown. Volman sees honour as being broken into 4 components: inner individual honour, outer individual honour, inner collective honour, and outer collective honour. I'll explain what each of these 4 represents. Inner individual honour. The honour one feels for oneself and the lengths one will go to attain or retain it. Outer individual honour. How one's individual honour is perceived by those around him. Inner collective honour. The inner honour of a unit of men and how collective acts work to attain or retain it. Outer collective honour. How a collective's honour is perceived by others, whether enemies or friendlies. Captain White's spiel about honour in this quote plays toward the inner collective honour of the Americans. He speaks about the land supposedly ceded back to the natives as an attack on their right, and thus their honour. In using this term honour, he has built himself a small army and whipped them up into a frenzy regarding a piece of land that, only a few years back, remember this book is set just after the Mexican-American War, belonged to the Mexicans. This is a common tactic used by figureheads, as delineating inner honour from outer honour can sometimes be impossible, as we are raised with certain expectations of ourselves and society. It can be hard to know where that honour stems from. Politicians and warmongers know this, so they use it for their own means. Seepitch concedes that finding a direct account that corresponds to Captain White's in Blood Meridian is not available. Nonetheless, small-scale filibustering expeditions around the late 1840s were rife at the time. Seepitch notes a famous account stemming from William Walker, who led an expedition into Sonora the following decade in 1853. He also notes that in the postscript to Chamberlain's memoirs, the editor of his memoirs noted that Chamberlain may have been involved in Walker's expedition. This means McCarthy would have most certainly been aware of the expeditions happening, but most likely concocted his own version of events. Events that likely ended in huge groups of men perishing. The men who were privately funded to enter these regions and seize territory likely hold no historical record anyway. This leads us to the famous Comanche attack scene. When on their expedition, Captain White's men, including the kid, are ambushed by a large group of Comanches. Again, this exact event is not directly pulled from one historical account, but many of the details and writing thereof can be cherry-picked from potential sources. First and foremost, let me quote this very long excerpt. Please bear with me. Already you could see through the dust on the ponies' hides, the painted chevrons and the hands and rising suns and birds and fish of every device, like the shade of old work through sizing on a canvas, and now too you could hear above the pounding of the unshod hooves, the piping of the keener, flutes made from human bones, and some among the company had begun to soar back on their mounts, and some to mill in confusion, when up from the offside of those ponies there rose a fabled horde of mounted lancers and archers bearing shields sped light with bits of broken mirror glass that cast 1,000 unpieced suns against the eyes of their enemies. A legion of horribles, hundreds in number, half naked or clad in costumes Attic or biblical or wardrobed out of a fevered dream, with the skins of animals and silk finery, and pieces of uniform still tracked with the blood of prior owners, coats of slain dragoons, frogged and braided cavalry jackets, one in a stovepipe hat and one with an umbrella, and one in white stocking and a blood-stained wedding veil, and some in headgear of crane feathers or rawhide helmets that bore the horns of bulls or buffalo, and one in a pigeon-tailed coat, worn backwards and otherwise naked, and one in the armour of a Spanish conquistador, the breastplate and pauldrons deeply dented with old blows of mace or sabre done in another country by men whose very bones were dust, and many with their braids spliced up with the hair of other beasts until they trailed upon the ground, and their horses' ear and tails worked with bits of brightly coloured cloth, and one whose horse's whole head was painted crimson red, and all the horses' faces gaudy and grotesque with daubings like a company of mounted clowns, deaf hilarious, all howling in a barbarous tongue, and riding down upon them like a horde from a hell more horrible yet than the brimstone land of Christian reckoning, screeching and yammering and clothed in smoke like those vaporous beings in regions beyond right, knowing where the eye wanders and the lip jerks and drools. The first thing to note is the writing style. This seemingly endless paragraph, coupled with the repetitive Hemingway-esque language, is reminiscent of John Reed's 1914 book Insurgent Mexico, a book Reed wrote after spending time in Mexico following the Mexican Revolution that occurred in 1910. The book details his first-hand account of the region as he speaks to soldiers and civilians alike. In chapter 3, titled The General Goes to War, Reed describes first seeing 100 of the Tropa. The style of the excerpt found in the second and third paragraphs of this chapter resembles McCarthy's in its style and content. For brevity's sake, I won't quote the full thing, but I have linked the PDF so you can read it for yourself. Just check it out in the description. However, to nitpick some pieces of Reed's writing, we see the endless paragraph, the descriptions of religious imagery, the flashing light reflecting off silver, the repetition of dust and ragged, and the overall inconsistency of the uniforms of the men on horseback as they run into view of Reed. To give you an idea of the potential influence of this excerpt, I'll read you the last of the second paragraph, but again, I recommend you check the full thing out for yourself. On the PDF, it's found on page 19. They came on the dead run, all Indian shouts and cracking revolvers, until they were only 100 feet away, then jerked their little cow ponies cruelly to a staggering halt with bleeding mouths, a whirling confusion of men, horses, and dust. One last connection to be made in this famous scene can be found in the way the Comanches hide themselves behind their horses. Seepitch claims that details of the Comanche attack were inspired by historian John Wesley Wilbarger and journalist William Hemsley Emery. Concerning the former, it is from an excerpt of his 1890 book Indian Depredations in Texas, wherein Wilbarger describes Comanches hiding behind their horses before massacring a village of inhabitants. The people of the village did not expect anything until it was too late. What they had first thought of as horses grazing in the distance suddenly became a 1,000-manned army of Comanches mounted on their steeds, catching the people completely unprepared. The survivors recalled the war whoops of the Comanche as they descended on their friends and family. With regard to the latter, Emery writes an account in his 1848 book Notes of a Military Reconnaissance, similar to Reed's account of La Tropa in Insurgent Mexico, wherein Emery describes the dust of an advancing group of natives on horseback along with their technicoloured riders. Seepitch believes these two accounts to be influential on this famous McCarthy scene, those being Wilbarger and Emery, for both the detail of the riders with regard to how they operated and how they looked. I believe, however, although not referenced in Seepitch's book, that Reed's Insurgent Mexico also influenced the writing style of this sequence too, with its seemingly endless paragraphs and repetitive language. I have linked all PDFs so you can view all of those sources for yourself, including of course Seepitch's notes on Blood Meridian. I've also given the page numbers for all of them in the description just so you can check it out. When violent actors perform before us, whether they be victims, perpetrators, or tools, then, if experience or professionalism has not yet made us inhuman, we tend to crave understanding almost deliberately, understanding being the offering we lay down on the altar of every force of power, and in its transformative abilities, violence is debatably the most powerful entity of all. As noted from this quote from Volman's Rising Up and Rising Down, we feel inclined to understand violence. Understanding is a step toward control. With control, we can stop violence or redirect it for our own purposes. But violence is multi-dimensional. It occurs on many planes, whether individually or collectively, whether justified or unjustified, or whether in self-defense or offense. These planes change with the backdrop and the point in time. We think of violence in black and white terms, and often do so based on our own ideals or prejudices, but violence has to be taken in its atomic state as an entity. The violence in Blood Meridian is so frequent that you become numb to it. McCarthy seems to blur all violence together in doing so. The first violent act to occur does so on page 2 when the kid is shot, and for the remainder of the narrative, Blood Meridian blends into an atmospheric depiction of the endless West, with its apocalyptic fires, blue storms, diatribes on war from the judge, and endless acts of violence against men, women, and children of all colours and creeds. Violence occurs, the men ride on. Evidently, this seems to be a deliberate component of Blood Meridian. As mentioned, the book is a historical novel, and so history too is a component, of which is the history of the Western frontier, a landscape like any other with its own bloody footprint and its own predetermined destiny. The men in Blood Meridian work in destinies. They're being strapped to history like elongated shadows connected to a larger darkness. The kid and Ballantyne in particular have excerpts that connect their time and space to those men of the past who had ridden or walked along the same plains as they. The judge, on the other hand, has no past. He also has no future. He is static. When the judge revisits the kid in 1878 at Fort Griffin, he hasn't aged. He is the same as he was. The kid, on the other hand, is now the man. The kid has physically and mentally evolved. The judge is still the same old judge. This is because the judge is less a person than a representation of the imperialism of the Americans, at least in my opinion. Just look at him. A tall, flabby white guy, dressed in smart clothing and obsessed with order and logic. He notes everything down in his notebook. He gives names to everything, has an eclectic knowledge, and he makes the claim that all things that exist without my knowledge exist without my consent. In the scene at Fort Griffin in the final chapter of Blood Meridian, there is going to be a dance. The judge describes the individual lives of those within the dance as being unrelated to the greater history of the whole event. That being the orchestration of the dance. He poured the tumbler full once more, and he took a drink himself from the bottle, and he wiped his mouth and turned to regard the room. This is an orchestration for an event. For a dance, in fact. The participants will be apprised of their roles at the proper time. For now, it is enough that they have arrived, as the dance is the thing with which we are concerned and contains complete within itself its own arrangement and history and finale. There is no necessity that the dancers contain these things within themselves as well. In any event, the history of all is not the history of each, nor indeed the sum of those histories, and none here can finally comprehend the reason for his presence, for he has no way of knowing, even in what the event consists. In fact, were he to know, he might well absent himself, and you can see that that cannot be any part of the plan if plan there be. This reminds me of an excerpt in Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, wherein he describes the Battle of Austerlitz, a battle that occurred during the Napoleonic Wars in 1805. Tolstoy too describes the individual emotions of that mass of men who were, with enough time, condensed into the 4 words, the Battle of Austerlitz. Granted, some people will be interested enough to dig through records in order to understand this battle to a greater degree and to understand the lives of some of those notable men who took part. But nonetheless, on the mass scale, it is only the Battle of Austerlitz, a brief dance of war on an otherwise never-ending plane of history, with all its many battles before and since. The judge represents the violence that connects all of the bones of these events, the war that endures, as he says. In chapter 17 of Blood Meridian, the judge commences his famous "War is God" speech, wherein he compares war to the truest form of divination. By this he means that the deciding of future events is predicated on war, on who wins and who loses, and by which the future molds itself thereafter. These wars or battles become bones connected to the next, which condense into names that umbrella the individual wills involved in such wars and battles. As time passes from these events, so too do the morals surrounding them, and eventually they become nothing more than the names given to them by their winners. It's how history works, and it is war, as the judge says, that connects all of these bones. Volman writes of a similar collective will that obscures the individual injustices in rising up and rising down. The sad law of collective violence, collective justice or not, sometimes disperses individual injustice. imminence, ignorance of actual circumstances, miscellaneous collective necessities, especially in war and revolution, bring about this result. All we can really say is that misfortunes do fall upon the undeserving, and that human justice, like fortune herself, cuts corners. My reasoning for believing the judge to represent this violence, this collective war that endures throughout, is down to the final paragraph of Blood Meridian, not including the epilogue of course. In this paragraph, the kid has been murdered by the judge, and the dance begins inside Fort Griffin. As the people dance, the judge dances better than anyone else. He spins, catches the attention of the ladies, and even plays the violin whilst doing so. In his head, he knows the rest to be dancing, but for himself to be the most real and best dancer of them all. He dances above the rest, literally and figuratively. He says he will never die, and by the looks of it in Blood Meridian, you would have to believe him, but he will someday. According to Harold Bloom in his book How to Read and Why, he believes hope is found through the kid, or the man at this stage, when he speaks to the judge prior to his murder. The judge speaks of the dance of war, and how once war is seen through a moralistic or dishonourable lens, those warriors built for war will be excluded, leaving only false dancers. But, the judge says, there will only be one real dancer left. He asks the kid who he thinks that might be, to which the kid responds, "You ain't nothing." Bloom sees this moment as heroic. Despite everything the kid has witnessed of the judge, and despite the judge's ability to charm his way into the good graces and trust of almost everyone he meets, the kid still defies him. In fact, many scenes in Blood Meridian display the kid's inherent goodness, even if he engages in the slaughtering of natives and Mexicans throughout the book. Multiple times he stays with wounded men who tell him to save himself, and he even attempts to help an old woman in the chapter before the large jump forward in time when the judge is killed, that being the final chapter. The old woman is dead, and he speaks to her corpse, telling her his hardships and background, concluding with his promise to bring her to safety. After spewing all of this, he realizes the woman's true condition. The kid's heroism is found in his attempt to break the cycle of violence, the enduring entity, but sometimes this enduring entity is forced to continue through the acts of others, even to those who wish for it to break. In chapter 11, the judge tells the gang a story wherein a traveller happens upon a harness maker, the latter of which asked the former for money. The traveller said no, but still the harness maker invites the young man to his house, where his wife cooked all of them food. At the end of the meal, the harness maker asked once again for some money, and the traveller relented. The harness maker then asked for some more, and the traveller grew furious, reprimanding the harness maker for his greed. Now the meal over, the harness maker offered to walk the traveller out to the nearest road. In doing so, he killed the traveller with a rock and buried him in a grave beside the road. Upon returning home, the harness maker lied to his wife and said himself and the traveller were attacked by robbers, with only him surviving. In later years, as the harness maker lay dying, he told his son of his crime, and his son forgave him. Once dead, his son went out to the west, and as McCarthy puts it, became a killer of men. In the final chapter, we meet the grandchild of the traveller named Elrod, who tries to ambush the kid, the man in this chapter, and gets himself killed. As Elrod's friends and brother Randall come to the kid to collect Elrod's remains, one of the friends gives us insight into the fact that he likely is the grandchild of the traveller told in the judge's tale. "They come out here from Kentucky, mister. This Tyke and his brother. His mama and daddy both dead. His granddaddy was killed by a lunatic and buried in the woods like a dog. He's never knowed good fortune in his life, and now he ain't got a soul in this world." After this, Elrod's gun is passed on to Randall, who the quote references, and the cycle continues, continued through force, by the kid, now the man. As we see, both the harness maker's son as well as the traveller's grandchildren, Elrod and Randall, continue on the cycle of violence. Violence breeds more violence. The epilogue to Blood Meridian further confirms the repetition of all things and is an odd summation of the overall point I want to convey when looking at one of the many threads of meaning in Blood Meridian. To do so, I will quote the full paragraph. "In the dawn there is a man progressing over the plain by means of holes which he is making in the ground. He uses an implement with two handles, and he chucks it into the hole, and he enkindles the stone in the hole with his steel hole by striking the fire out of the rock which God has put there. On the plain behind him are the wanderers in search of bones and those who do not search, and they move haltingly in the light like mechanisms whose movements are monitored with escapement and palate so that they appear restrained by a prudence or reflectiveness which has no inner reality, and they cross in their progress one by one that track of holes that runs to the rim of the visible ground, and which seems less the pursuit of some continuance than the verification of a principle, a validation of sequence and casualty, as if each round and perfect whole owed its existence to the one before it, there on that prairie upon which are the bones and the gatherers of bones, and those who do not gather. He strikes fire in the hole and draws out his steel. Then they all move on again. To me, the holes in these excerpts are the events of history. As I said, each bone of a historical event is connected to the next. I believe McCarthy in his apocalyptic way is trying to get that same message across. As well as this, I like how this epilogue does not allow the judge to have the final say. It in fact diminishes the previous happenings and chalks it up, in my opinion at least, to just another event on the plane of history. A whole similar to that of all those before and after it. Every book is one individual orchestration of one of these events. To a greater degree, Blood Meridian is a greater example of this orchestration, this dance, if you will. It is the chronicling of many men's histories, some directly referenced like John Joel Glanton, some indirectly referenced like Samuel Chamberlain, into two words: Blood Meridian. The all-American Western violence that took place on those plains just following the greater violence of the Mexican-American War all falls into the fictional chronicling of Blood Meridian, from the unique, archaically articulated perspective of Cormac McCarthy. This is his dance. Like the four books before it, Blood Meridian was published to a deafening silence. Business as usual. Less than 5,000 copies sold. But no worries, as McCarthy had been here before. Many times. He'll pick up another grant and/or fellowship and move on to the next project. Maybe even get another wife. Well, perhaps not totally business as usual. Blood Meridian would prove to be the final McCarthy novel published under Random House and with the editor Albert Erskine. Erskine had been McCarthy's editor for 20 years and had encouraged McCarthy's writing for that long stretch of unrecognised time. He was pivotal in McCarthy's development as a writer. Now McCarthy was trying something new. Kind of. McCarthy continued in the same vein as Blood Meridian. By that I mean sticking to the Texas-Mexico Southwest of the mid-1800s. He would continue this infatuation with this historic period in his next three books, collectively named the Border Trilogy. The novels in chronological order are All the Pretty Horses, The Crossing, and Cities of the Plain. All the Pretty Horses would later be adapted to film. By now McCarthy had finally begun to get some attention. Age had also softened McCarthy up to granting the occasional interview here or there. McCarthy's next two books would come 1 year after the other. The first, No Country for Old Men, was published in 2005, and the second, The Road, was published in 2006. Both movies would be adapted to the screen, with the former becoming a huge critical and financial success. By now, McCarthy's name was becoming globally known and his bank account had benefited heavily from it. Later in life, McCarthy moved just outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he would spend many years reading and also where he would draw his last breath. His final two novels, The Passenger and Stella Marie, were published in 2022. In 2024, an article titled 2 years after Cormac McCarthy's death, Rare Access to His Personal Library Reveals the Man Behind the Myth, written by Richard Grant, was published in the Smithsonian. It is from this article I discovered the scholars who were sifting through McCarthy's personal library of near to 20,000 books. When I read this article, I couldn't help feeling as if McCarthy was taking the role of the judge. I'd recommend reading it for yourself, but as a quick summary, the scholars found books on almost every topic, the majority of which were thumbed and marked up along the margins. Occasionally they found pieces of paper folded within the books containing McCarthy's thoughts. It is almost as if, like the judge, he is trying to note down and make sense of everything he possibly can. Or, the more obvious conclusion was the previously made one that McCarthy was just an autodidact. It seems this was most certainly the case. McCarthy, first and foremost, had a love of reading. This is only speculation, but I'd assume writing came second. Writing seemed more like an instinctive need rather than a conscious pursuit. The reading came first. It's no wonder he was able to plough through so many books whilst researching for Blood Meridian. And so, when he was coming toward the end of his life, McCarthy focused on what he loved. In doing so, I wonder whether he looked back on his life, or his legacy as an author, his commitment to his own ideals. Once the biographies and documentaries start releasing to the public, we'll get the full spectrum. But for now, I only want to portray him as a man whose first and foremost priority in life was the written word, whether created or consumed. McCarthy was a lucky man in many respects. To make a fortune, even at such an old age, from his writing alone is a hard thing to achieve. But the biggest stroke of luck, to me, could be found in his final seconds of life. In the living room of his Santa Fe home, McCarthy began to slip from this life with much accomplished and much left to be said for the rest of the world. He had seen the realization of his genius, and he had succeeded in his goals. And most importantly, he had died surrounded by what he loved most, his family and his books.